Okay, good morning, everyone. Good morning from Mexico. Good afternoon to Europe. Thank you, everyone, for joining this joint webinar of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. It's a first. It's something that hasn't happened before, and we have a very interesting topic. It's a cooperation between the offices of Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Canada and in Mexico. And the webinar session, as you know, is titled "The Trade War Among Treaty Partners?" ? And we will be discussing recent recent political developments in North America that have happened since the beginning of the year. A lot has happened everywhere in the world, but especially in terms of trade policy, it's been some interesting months, to say the least. And I may introduce our class directors from the offices from Mexico and from Canada. First of all, Dr. Bernd Altesmann is going to give a welcome address as class director from Canada, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning to everyone from Ottawa, dear esteemed guests, colleagues, and friends. It is my greatest pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar on behalf of CAS Canada. We are very delighted to co-host this event with Konrad Adenauer Foundation Mexico office. I would like to express my sincere thanks to Stefan Lohmeier and his wonderful team for the excellent cooperation and the opportunity to jointly explore such a timely and relevant topic. Mexico and Canada, two nations that share not only geography, but also deep economic and political ties with our common neighbor, the United States, stand as key players in the North American trade framework. As partners in the CUSMA, Mexico and Canada have worked hard to build a rules-based economic space that fosters prosperity, innovation, and stability across the continent. Against that backdrop of the vision for North America, a brief preliminary remark on the situation in Canada. The country recently elected a new parliament in the midst of a global trade war. The new government of Prime Minister Mark Carney was sworn in yesterday. Already during the election campaign, he made clear his hard line against the repeatedly announced and postponed punitive tariffs against Canada, with his announcement, "Elbows up," borrowed from the national sport of ice hockey. The latest signals from the US of possible exceptions for Canada and possibly Mexico, and the reference to CUSMA, products of the Common Economic Area, may be recognizable. But the economic consequences of this trade war are noticeable, at least in Canada. The close ties between Canadian and US industries have been beneficial for many years, but under current conditions will cause significant economic damage on both sides. Unemployment, for example, has risen again to almost 7%, and the productivity of the Canadian economy is falling. However, Canada is not defenseless in the conflict with the US. US industry is heavily dependent on Canada in the north as its energy supplier. The automotive and supplier industries in both countries are closely linked. They are, as are the mining industries and the chemical industry as well. Due to its immense mineral resources, Canada is one of the most important suppliers of raw materials in the world, but especially in the USA. This is the reason for Canada's trade surplus, which has been criticized by the US and especially their President Donald Trump. The boycott of US goods will hardly be able to compensate for the expected consequences for the Canadian market. Experts from the Chamber of Commerce expect significant stunts in gross domestic product of up to 2% in the coming years. Canada will present its Agenda 2025 now as the G7 presidency country in June. The future of free trade and the stability of global trade in times of increasingly digitalized and AI-based world trade will also be a crucial question. However, existing agreements such as CUSMA agreement or the CETA agreement with the European Union are also coming further into the spotlight for Canada due to weakened but existing trade and customs conflicts between the US and China. The existing CETA agreement has not been ratified in all countries of the European Union, and it has apparently only been used to 60% so far. Technical standards and environmental protection standards sometimes make acceptance and implementation more difficult. Ultimately, the key question for Canada is how it can further expand its independence from the United States on the one hand, and at the same time make its economy crisis-proof and resilient. Of course, Canada is looking towards Mexico. Recent developments have cast a shadow over this vision of prosperity, innovation, and stability across the continent. While tariffs and trade controls are expanding rapidly around the world, macro uncertainty is also growing. For example, McKinsey Company classifies the second quarter of the 2025 as first global economic shock since COVID-19. And indeed, in February, both Mexico and Canada were taken back by the news that United States, after weeks of public threats and speculation, had moved forward with the imposition of tariffs. For countries bound together not only by geography, but by treaties grounded in mutual trust and legal certainty, such actions are deeply troubling. The current developments raise for Canada and Mexico critical questions. What do such unilateral measures mean for the credibility of trade agreements like the USMCA or CUSMA agreement? How resilient are our regional partners when confronted with political or economic pressure? And how have Canada and Mexico responded so far together? This conversation also had a global dimension, as we observe growing trade tensions in different parts of the world. Europe to find itself navigating a complex and rapidly evolving landscape. How might the European Union act now to keep its economic strength, support its allies, and reinforce the rules-based international trade system? As a German political foundation, I think it is crucial to raise this topic and discuss with our reliable partner countries. Today's discussion offers us a valuable opportunity to reflect on these issues from different national and regional perspectives. We are really honored to be joined by two experts who will help us better understand the current dynamics and the policy options available. Professor Patrick Leblanc from the University of Ottawa, Canada, and Professor Georges Chiavon from Universitat Iberoamericana from Mexico. I'm confident that the insights by the two profs will not only enrich our understanding, but also inspire forward-looking dialogue and cooperation. Once again, thank you for being with us today. We look forward to your thoughts, questions, and engagement as we navigate these important discussions together, Canada and Mexico. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Altersmann. I may now pass the word for an inaugural address to Mr. Blomeyer, CAST Director in Mexico.
Thank you, Maximilian. Very welcome. Good morning from Mexico City. Happy to join this joint effort. As has been said, it is a real premiere. For the first time, offices in Canada and Mexico are joining in a joint discussion. And first of all, I would like to thank Dr. Bernd Altersmann and his team in Ottawa for helping us to build this app and joining us in this conversation this morning here. Obviously, also thank our two experts, which have already been mentioned, Professor Patrick Leblanc from Ottawa and my dear friend Jorge Schiavon, not from Mexico. He is in Warsaw in Poland right now, but from Universidad Iberoamericana here in Mexico. I will only add a few comments to this to the very meaningful introduction from Bernd Altusmann, who said everything which has to be said. For a start, just saying that I think we are in the middle of, from a German perspective, in the middle of a understanding North America is a diverse but highly integrated region. USA, Mexico, and Canada. We still struggle in Europe. When we say North America, we normally mean the US, but it's way more than the US. Is this highly integrated region that we have to understand as a highly integrated region, despite the disruptions coming from Washington in these last weeks and months. And if we understand this region as a region, integrated region, economic powerhouse, then I think it's easy to say that has to be a natural partner for us in Europe, for us in Germany. Mexican reactions, Jorge will tell us more about that, has been so far keep cool and carry on. It's not been easy for the Mexican government to keep cool because messages from Washington has been quite disturbing, to say something friendly in this context. But from a German perspective, 2,100 German companies are operating in Mexico right now, not because they want to operate just in Mexico, because they operate in North America. So that's one argument why we have to understand what's going on in this region and why this matters to us in Europe, what's going on here. So this is not just an issue. If Donald Trump threatens Canada and Mexico, we can relax and say, well, that's their problem. No, it is our problem. And therefore, we have to look very deeply and with very much detail into what's going on. And we have to look beyond just the tariff issue, because we have learned over the past weeks that tariffs go up and down, and it seems to be random what's going on there. There's a bigger agenda behind that, and the agenda is whether we see ourselves as like-minded partners or not, and if we do so, what do we have to do to strengthen this relationship? So this is the tariff war is not just a threat, but also an opportunity to look into our relations, Canada-Mexico relations, Canada-Europe-Germany relations, Mexico-Europe relations, and so on. So that is also an opportunity, but what we might have neglected in the years past. So I think this is also an invitation to redefine transatlantic relationships beyond the actual tariff war. So this is an invitation to talk not just about each other. It is an invitation to engage in a meaningful, respectful, and hopefully interesting dialogue, or to make it short, to talk to each other. That's the intention. And hopefully this is just, speaking in Casablanca terms, just the beginning of a new friendship between Mexico, Europe, Germany, and Canada. So it matters more than ever to build bridges, to build meaningful relations, and to build a model of like-minded partners. That's what's driving us as Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. So again, thank you very much, Bernd, to your team, Jorge, Patrick, for your insights. And hopefully this is just the beginning of a series of joint events. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Blomeyer. And in order to engage in such serious discussion, we need a technical base and we need expertise, and we have broad expertise today here. And I may first give the floor to Professor Jorge Schiavon from the Universidad Iberoamericana, where he's a full-time professor at the Department of International Studies. He's joining us today from Poland. Thank you very much for your time, Jorge. Adelante.
Well, thank you, and it's a huge pleasure being here. I sincerely celebrate the fact that we are organizing a webinar to better understand how North America is reacting to Donald Trump, and especially since I always say that in North America we have 2.5 relationships. A very important relationship between Canada and the US, a very important relationship between the US and Mexico, and half a relation between Canada and Mexico. And this has to do with the US being so relevant for each of the countries that the relevance of Mexico for Canada and Canada for Mexico is much is lesser than it is that compared to its relationship with the US. So what I'll do is I will share with you a presentation that I have prepared to facilitate sharing with you my ideas. And I will put on my timer because there's nothing more dangerous than giving the floor to an academic who can talk for hours and hours. So it's 15 minutes and it has already started. So what I would like to share with you is how Mexico has reacted based on its foreign policy history and how we have been using a strategy that we have created for almost 100 years to contain the US. And now, especially, the question is, can we also contain Donald Trump and its worst policies in terms of going against the regional integration in North America, specifically the tariffs, but in the case of Mexico, it's also security, it's also migration. So the central question is, how can we contain Donald Trump? And is this strategy of multi-level diplomacy replicable by other countries, specifically Canada? So where do we come from? Well, it's very easy. The US is the most relevant variable, both for Canada and for Mexico, in terms of its foreign policy. And it's been like that, at least for the last 150 years, because the US has been the hegemonic power in North America since the mid-19th century. And today it definitely is. What I would say that Trump 2.0, that is Trump reloaded, as I like calling him, is not only bad news for the US, but it's bad news for North America, specifically for Canada and for Mexico, and also for the world, for Germany, for Europe, for Japan, for South Korea, for everywhere around the world. Why? Because he's not a professional politician, and what he does is he conducts personalized, non-institutional management of public policies. That is, he's a populist. And what he's been doing, at least in the 100 and something days that he's been in office, is using uncertainty as a negotiation strategy. And what he has also done is continue something that he had started in his first term, which is the institutional deconstruction of the US state and also of international organizations. And at this time, he has also appointed unconditional ministers for the different ministries in the case of the US, specifically in the State Department, that is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But also the US, Mexico, Canada, the world, we're facing a multiple global crisis, which is economic. And what we're starting to see is recession with inflation, something that we haven't seen since the 1970s. But also, and what's even more concerning, is social fragmentation and polarization. And at the same time, what we see is that those institutions that we created after the end of the Second World War are in crisis. Multilateralism and the institutions of Bretton Woods and of San Francisco are in international crisis, are in a governance crisis at this moment. And finally, we have those red spots in the world, like the invasion of Russia to the Ukraine in the Middle East, and undoubtedly the competition, if you don't want to call it the new Cold War or technology war, between the US and Canada. So where are we from a Mexican perspective and the US perspective? Well, first and foremost, we see, as we hadn't, at least in the course of the last decades in the US, a huge concentration of power, because this time Trump received the popular vote with over 50% 50%, and the electoral vote with 312 delegates compared to Biden. But also, this concentration of power means that he has the control over both chambers of the legislature, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. And here is something different from the cases of Canada and Mexico, at least the case of Mexico. If you have a majority in the legislature in the US, you control also the presidencies of every committee within the House in the United States. So that means he does not only control the chambers as a majority, but also he controls the presidencies of each and every committee within the Senate and the House of Representatives. And also something that we've seen is that the Supreme Court, especially based on two nominations made by the first Trump administration, has changed from being a mostly liberal to a mostly conservative Supreme Court. And we also see that this concentration of power is sustained through bureaucratic control and deprofessionalization of the institutions of the U.S. state. And this is interesting because you see that he has been governing through executive orders instead of preferring legislation because it is faster. It gives the idea that it's the president who's taking the lead. And what we also see is a clash in what I would call the cultural values of the U.S. That is the liberal democracy, human rights, liberty values, going to the left, the woke values vis-a-vis the conservative values of the Make America Great Again movement. And what we also see is that for the first time in many, many decades, we see that this is the first generation in the US which is worse off than their parents, and this hasn't happened in the history of the United States, at least since the 20th century. So the losers from globalization are very angry, and that's why in his first administration, and once again during his second administration, Trump received over 75 million votes in the election of 2020, which he lost, and now in the election of 2024. But what we see, therefore, is that we are experiencing a moment of fragmentation and polarization in the case of the US, where the center is practically disappearing. And therefore, we see also a shift of ideological to cultural confrontation. That is, it doesn't matter that much whether you're from the left or the right, but more if you believe in the institutions based on the US Constitution, or you believe in the figure of a leader, a populist leader like Donald Trump. And it's horrible to say it, but from what we've seen in terms of his 100 and something days in office, what we see is that this populism is tending toward fascism because we're seeing restriction of freedoms and concentration of power with weakening oppositions, not only the Democrats, but also the liberals, the universities, civil society. And what's horrible, at least from a Mexican perspective, is that something which was socially unacceptable until very recently has now become socially acceptable because the president says it, and therefore I, as a citizen, can also say it. So racism and xenophobia, unfortunately, are acceptable to be openly said in the U.S. right now. And the short-term strategy of what we see in the U.S. is that he's interested in having full control of politics, economics, and even the values of U.S. society. And he's flooding with executive orders on all fronts and attacking the opponent, both internal and external. However, there is one good news, and that is that from the election in November of 2024 up until today, he has almost lost 20 points in terms of approval, from 60% to a little bit over 40%. Now, what are the priority agenda items from the U.S.-Mexico relationship? Well, they're different from those in the case of Canada, because Canada, it's mostly trade and investment, that is tariffs, as a way to reduce the deficit between Canada and the U.S. But in the case of Mexico, it's also migration, which, by the way, is no longer an issue because Mexico is now controlling the migration flows, and people entering in an irregular way through the U.S. southern border is at its lowest in the last 20-something years. But also what we see is that in terms of security, trafficking of drugs, fentanyl, is generating not only a health situation, a health problem in the US, but also a security problem. And also what we see is that Trump is behaving as a neo-imperialist in its relations with the world, specifically saying that Canada should become state number 51, that he wants to buy Greenland, that he wants to take control over Panama. That is, this is the idea of a new neo-imperialism in North America and the Americas, which is different from the process of regional integration that we've had at least since 1994. So the question is, what can we do, or what should we do? Well, here are some numbers in terms of Mexico in 12 indicators. I won't go over them because of lack of time, but let me just say that from wherever you see it, Mexico is a relevant country in world affairs, and specifically in North America, because we're always between number 5 and number 15 in practically any variable that you use. But what's most important is that Mexico exports 80% of everything it exports, just as Canada does, to the US, and it imports approximately 55% of everything it imports from the US. So that means that we are truly engaged in this regionalization process, and therefore we are stuck in North America, whether we like it or not. Now, the most important relationship for Mexico is obviously the United States. And what I always say is that Mexico has a triangular foreign policy. What does this mean? That whenever Mexico is implementing its foreign policy vis-a-vis any other country, be it Germany, be it Canada, be it within the United Nations, it always has to see what the effect is on its bilateral relation with the US. That's why it's always a triangle in which we have to see what the impact of a bilateral or regional or multilateral relation is with our most important relation, that is the United States. So what we see is that not only do we export 80% and import 50% of all our international trade, but we receive approximately 50% of all foreign direct investment from the United States, and we have somewhere between 38 and 40 million people of Mexican origin living in the US. 12 million of them were born in Mexico, and half of them, approximately 6 million, are in an irregular migratory situation within the United States. So, and by the way, we also received over $60 billion a year. $68 billion was last year in remittances from these Mexicans living abroad. Now, what's interesting is that Mexico has understood how important it is to manage its relationship with the US. And I always say that in politics, including foreign policy, priorities are measured in budget, and Mexico invests 50% of the budget and 50% of the personnel of the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs just to manage two relationships, that is, with Canada and the US, and the other 50% for the 191 other countries in the world. Just let me give you an example on how important it is. Mexico has the largest consular network that a country has in another country, with 52 consulates inside the US. And what's interesting is that the Mexican consulates within the US not only do consular work, that is documentation, protection, and attention to our communities abroad, but they serve as mini embassies in 52 of the most relevant cities in the US. You might think that 52 because there's 50 states in the US. Well, no, we have them positioned in those areas which are most relevant for Mexico. For example, 11 in Texas, 10 in California, 4 in Arizona, 1 in New Mexico. So 26 out of the 52 consulates are in the 4 border states that the US has with Mexico. And this has allowed Mexico to conduct this strategy that we've been doing at least since the Porfiriato, that is the end of the 19th century, which is multi-level diplomacy. So what is multi-level diplomacy? Based on this idea that all politics are local politics in the US, the US political, economic, and social system is a very porous one, full of checks and balances, and socially diverse, with strong democratic institutions, even if Trump is trying to deconstruct them. So the strategy is let the democratic system in the US function and use also multi-level diplomacy to try to contain Trump. The only thing that will contain Trump is obviously US democracy. And this has to do with the idea of working together with those relevant players within the US, which can serve as a way to contain the worst policies of Donald Trump. So we can work, as we've done with the professional bureaucracy within the US, with the powers of the union, especially the legislative and the judiciary, especially those which still believe in the traditional values of US democracy and US liberty, with political parties, especially with the Democrats, but also with Republicans, which aren't happy with the MAGA movement, but also work, as we've done, with cities and with the US states, especially those which are contending the policies of Trump, and mostly also work with those actors which are related to their benefits in terms of economic relation with Mexico and with Canada. That is, private entrepreneurs, academia, unions, civil society organizations, and we have also the idea of letting democracy work. So it's not that Claudia Sheinbaum keeps her head cool. She's using a strategy of winning time for democratic institutions within the US to work. And finally, what we've seen is that Mexico has learned into how to penetrate the US political system with our network of 52 consulates and our embassy in Washington in terms of conducting executive diplomacy, not only with the presidency, but with each and every of the ministries of the US government, also working in terms of doing lobbying within the legislature, the state, the Senate, and the House of Representatives, but not only Washington, but also at the local constituencies, using our network of 52 consulates, mostly doing local diplomacy through which Mexican subnational governments are also working on an everyday basis with local and state actors within the US, and also conducting public diplomacy and therefore building strong relationships with transnational enterprises, non-government organizations, academia, media, entrepreneurs, trade unions. That is, Mexico does through its consular diplomacy, public diplomacy, to build these networks in terms of making sure that we are working together with those relevant players within the US political system, which can serve in terms of maintaining a manageable relationship between Mexico and the US. And the final question is this replicable? Yes, of course it's replicable. As long as you are wishing to invest in terms of your foreign policy capacities, you can also build from the local to the state to the federal in the US, and therefore work this multi-level diplomacy to attend and to try to constrain the worst policies of Donald Trump. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Jorge. There was a wonderful input, and you touched upon many interesting topics and angles. And we will now move to the Canadian perspective. We have Professor Patrick LeBlanc. Here, he's Associate Professor at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. And the moment we see his video.
Can you hear me? I'm here, except that it tells me okay, that my video had been locked. Okay, all right.
There we go. There we go.
Thank you, Maximilian. Well, I can only agree with what Jorge said, so I will build on that. I'm not sure that my perspective is actually a Canadian one. It's more of a personal one. Hopefully, it will become a Canadian one. I think there's already a lot of push in that direction, although we're seeing a bit of two tensions, so it seems, in Canada. The first one is obviously anger, frustration, disappointment with what's been happening in the United States with the Trump 2.0 administration, in terms of the tariffs, in terms especially also the 51st state annexation of Canada, all this rhetoric that at first was considered a joke, but now is actually taken seriously in the context of, as Jorge mentioned, this kind of some kind of neo-imperialist approach or vision to the world, and the creation of spheres of influence. So in North America or the Americas, and then China with more the Asia Pacific, and then Russia with Europe. So we do take these approaches very seriously. The big question is what to do about it. And there are some like me who say, okay, this is a complete shift. We have to go, reduce our dependence, spend as much as we can to do so economically in terms of our security, because this is an existential threat for Canada. There are others who are saying, well, let's wait, let's see, let's not blow up the Canadian bank in terms of, if we have to borrow for investments or these kinds of things. We already have a deficit, which, according to the world is not that big, but for Canadians, it's considered quite big. So there's a kind of wait and see and try to stabilize the relationship with the US and potentially even go deeper, like try to make a deal with Donald Trump that would allow Canada to secure its access to the United States. So these are kind of the one is, okay, well, let's manage the US. We can't ignore them. We have to deal with them. But it's just a relationship that has to be managed where we're kind of much more into damage control as opposed to, yes, we're friends, let's work together. Let's build a North American economy, which was what we've had since pretty much the end of the 1980s, and with Mexico as part of that. So my view is, obviously, as I've mentioned, is that the main goal for Canada, and I would say other liberal democracies, like-minded allies, would be to reduce our dependence on the United States, because I don't believe that the US is going to go back to so-called normal anytime soon. So I take seriously the possibility that Donald Trump could be there for a third term. But even if he's not there, this current kind of MAGA control of the US government, including in Congress, is likely to continue. So let's say I don't put a lot of faith in the US institutional or democratic guardrails to rein in Donald Trump. I think what we've seen in the last few months shows that this administration is willing to go very far, and they're willing to move very fast to achieve that. And it's going to take a long time before the US kind of goes back to at least what many of us have seen as a democratic, stable country. So I think things are likely to get worse before they get better. And I think we need to plan for that. And also it means that the US is no longer a trusted ally, but a relationship to be managed the same way that Canada and I guess Mexico have been dealing with China, for instance, which is, yes, we want to do business with China. Yes, there are areas where we can cooperate, but we're certainly not going to integrate ourselves into the Chinese sphere of influence, right? And there are many other countries that are also trying to stay in a way on the fence between China and the US, especially in the Indo-Pacific. So in Canada's term, it's kind of that balance that we're trying to achieve and looking for allies to do so. So how can we reduce our dependence on the US economy, on US security, as quickly as possible, and that's where we're looking at allies like Mexico, on the European Union, the UK, and on the Indo-Pacific countries like Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, potentially also ASEAN countries, which are again trying to find a middle ground so that they're not pushed one way or the other. So it does require a lot of new cooperation and coordination. For instance, Jorge mentioned how the fact that Mexico has all these consular offices, missions inside the United States, so does Canada, maybe not to the same extent, but I think we have 30 plus in Canada. So both Mexico and Canada are very well placed, obviously, to influence what's happening in the US, to do public diplomacy, to interact with, in a way, allies, but also those who believe in US democracy and can kind of fight back to the authoritarian policies and tendencies of the Trump administration. But again, so that means that I think Canada and Mexico should coordinate to do that, as opposed to completely kind of either overstepping or replicating things. So we should try to be, because resources are limited. So how much can we cooperate with each other? And then how much can we cooperate with our like-minded partners in Europe and the Indo-Pacific to do so again, and trying to pass messages, trying to support, a little bit like we did in Eastern Europe or in other countries that are, we're trying to do democracy support, but it seems that now this is what we're going to have to do with the United States. In a way that, the U.S. is a rich country, but it's starting to behave as a kind of authoritarian emerging country. So again, the playbook for democracy support will apply to the United States for possibly the next decade. So we need to prepare for that, and we need to work together to doing that. Also, in terms of so this is kind of to support democracy and in the US and try to make this kind of an authoritarian move as limited as possible and as short as possible. I think that should be the objective. On the reducing our economic dependence, well, that means doing more business with each other. Yes, there's a lot of talk of more economic activity within Canada, more trade within Canada, but a lot of it also will be diversifying our trade from the United States. And I think, for Mexico, that's probably the same logic, at least from what I've heard from Jorge. So again, how can we work together? How can we do more business together? How can we facilitate that? Well, we need to work on infrastructure. We need to find ways to make our various trade agreements interoperable. So, Canada, yes, have the USMCA, but they also have the CPTPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Both Canada and Mexico have free trade agreements or economic partnership agreements with the European Union. So how could we make all this work better so that companies, that maybe European companies that want to sell to Canada and want to integrate Mexican parts could have all, in terms of the rules of origin, have all that recognized so that they can benefit from the zero tariffs that are associated with these free trade agreements, or with the same way with maybe the Japanese or the Koreans who also have trade agreements with the European Union, for instance. And we know that the UK now is part of CPTPP. There's talk about the EU potentially entering the CPTPP. So we really have to look at ways where we can facilitate trade between the businesses between our countries, and make sure that not only do they have the support that they need to kind of pull away from the United States, right? We know in Mexico and Canada that gravity plays a strong role because the US is next door. It's the richest economy. It's easy to do business there. But pulling away from this, a little bit like, pulling away from the Earth's gravity, requires a lot of energy, a lot of power and resources. And this is where, all of us, whether in Canada and Mexico and Europe, in the Indo-Pacific, have to really come together and look at how we can do this without trying to say, okay, well, can we integrate our free trade agreements better? How can we help our businesses learn about accessing the EU market? Is there things that could be done for both Mexican and Canadian businesses in terms of accessing the EU market, as opposed to always kind of replicating or reinventing the wheel? Are there things that could be done to facilitate that, to work together, whether it's kind of trade missions or seminars or I don't know, but I think it requires this kind of thinking out of the box, and this is the opportunity, obviously, that the Trump administration offers both Canada and the US. And I think also, in addition to that, we need to work together to maintain the rules of the game, right? Whether it's the WTO, whether it's other international organizations that the Trump administration seems to be willing to pull away from. As you probably know, it's already suspended its contribution to the WTO. It's rethinking its participation in the agreement. So I think it's really important for countries that believe in, the rule of law, in the international trade systems, the rule-based international order, with democracy behind and legitimacy and representation, to maintain that system, so that we don't have, once the U.S. gets through its phase, hoping that it will return to a democratically liberal economy and government, who God knows when, that the system will still be there for it to rejoin it, as opposed to really starting from scratch as we did, after World War II. So that's, again, I think it falls on Canada, it falls on Mexico, it falls on the EU and the UK and other countries in the Indo-Pacific, to make sure that happens, and then, kind of protect that and use it for our own benefit. It's like, if the US doesn't want to play ball, that's fine. We can play together. We can do business together. We can secure our economies by doing joint procurement when it comes to defense or other security aspects. How do we make sure that we're not dependent on US infrastructure for the internet, for, telecommunications, Starlink, all these kinds of things? Well, again, we don't all have to build our own networks and infrastructure. We can cooperate by doing that together. And I think this is all that we need to do. And it requires, I think, as Jorgen mentioned, our governments working together at various levels of governments, within countries, but also across the Atlantic, across the Pacific, and also with businesses, because ultimately businesses have to be part of that equation. So we should not think that it's just government, but we can't leave it to one or the other. This is kind of a whole of society, whole of government, whole of the world, in a way, in terms of the liberal democratic world, working together and kind of pushing back and creating its own sphere of influence, so that we're not, we can fight back against the Russians, the Chinese, and the Americans, and have leverage in negotiating with them, and ultimately minimizing the damage that they can put on us. And to go back, I think I remember a discussion with Dr. Altusman, where he was talking about, Jorge talked about this triangular foreign policy, but in a way it's a new kind of triangular foreign policy, where if you're looking at Canada, US, Mexico, and then EU and the Indo-Pacific, this creates a nice triangle with, the US in the middle is like this big donut hole, but we can all work around that together. We have this access. So we should see how we can maximize the benefits of it while reducing the challenges brought to us by the US, but also by China and others. And it's a big challenge, but I think we have the resources, the know-how, and the people to do that. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor LeBlanc. Very interesting takes, especially you said early on that the relationship would now not be too much of an ally anymore with the United States, but a relationship to be managed. I think it was really interesting take. Tells about the shift that has happened recently, right? We have a couple of questions to both of you. For example, Mr. Altusman is asking if we need a new CUSMA agreement. I guess that's the Canadian version of USMCA, and new and additional agreements between Canada and the European Union. That's a question for, I guess, both of you. Whoever wants to go first.
Okay, thank you, Jorge. Well, quickly, right now it's really not clear what a renegotiation of the USMCA or CUSMA, or I forget what the Mexican acronym is. But right now I think my view is we should look at the US in terms of just making deals that don't cost us very much, giving as little as possible. It seems that this administration is really not into the comprehensive trade agreement type deal. It seems to be looking for quick wins. So let's see how we can give them quick wins. It seems that the Chinese did it, the UK did it. Not clear what the Americans really got in exchange, but hey, if that works, let's try, and it buys us time. I think at this point, the more we can buy time, the more we can prevent things from getting worse without necessarily making them better. Or if we can make them better, that's great. But I don't see the USMCA, I mean, for me, the US has pulled out of the USMCA in a way by doing what it has done in terms of tariffs and the threats. And then on the other aspects, in terms of cooperation, it's not clear how much there is or how much there will be. So I think we have to be very careful entering in a negotiation with the US right now when it comes to a large agreement, because it's not clear that this is where the Americans want to go. And the danger is that if we put stuff on the table, then will the Americans use tariffs to try to say, oh, now you've you've offered us this. Well, it's not like we're negotiating a comprehensive agreement. No, we'll just take this and we're going to impose tariffs to make sure that you give it to us in a kind of mafia style approach. And as for Canada and the EU, and as I said, I think CETA is a great basis for cooperation. We can do more. I think we should look at the institutional mechanisms within CETA that exist. The fact that ministers and others meet only maybe once a year, I don't think it's enough given the current circumstances. I think we should look at more frequent meetings. We should perhaps look at those meetings in some cases to bring in the Mexicans, for as opposed to, again, Canada, EU, Mexico, EU. Well, maybe there are ways where we can cooperate, especially if there are areas of common concern among the three countries or three jurisdictions. So I think we should look at that. But I think we should have a bit like in a warlike mentality. This is not the usual way of doing things. So the more we can speak to each other and be in contact and see this as kind of ongoing negotiations, ongoing things happening, and having the meetings that took place, that take place on a regular basis. Maybe it's a quarterly meeting. We have to do that, as opposed to, we meet once a year, we have a nice little summit, everything's nice, we have a communique, a few things move forward, but that's kind of it. And then, I think we need to be more ambitious when it comes to our agendas. And I think that's really the way to go. And then it's looking at ways where we can help, especially SMEs, do business. Canadian SMEs doing business in the EU, EU SMEs doing business in Canada and Mexico. And how can we help and kind of take them along the road? Because it's not just here. Go on the website, look at how the population size, and go and do business in the EU. That's not how it works, and as we all know. So it requires a lot more hand-holding, which requires resources. But again, is there ways where we can share the burden and somehow share the knowledge that is required to help this? So I think we need to have a lot more discussions on that front, but use the institutional basis that we have in our trade agreements.
I think we should always remember history, and it is recent history. When Trump won the presidency on the first time, he said that he was going to throw to the trash the worst agreement ever signed by the US, which was NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And he didn't. He actually renegotiated into the USMCA, which is a better agreement than NAFTA. So the question is, why? Why did he change so dramatically? And the answer is simple: because those relevant players within the U.S. political, economic, and social system put pressure in the renegotiation of the agreement. And actually, based on the same rules of the USMCA, not only do we have to do a revision in 2026, but most probably what will happen is that we'll start the revision of the treaty, which will be a renegotiation, by the way, as early as 2025. And it's a good opportunity to actually improve in terms of a better strategy for containing Trump through the relevant players within the U.S. economic, political, and social system. So we can do it. Yes, we did it just, 7 years ago. So we can definitely do it again. What will we have to do? Obviously, we'll have to give some concessions to the U.S. For the renegotiation of NAFTA into the USMCA, we had to accept that neither Canada nor Mexico could sign an agreement with a non-market economy, that is China. So most probably what will happen in this renegotiation of the USMCA agreement to whatever it becomes will also imply, to a large extent, not allowing investment from China in the territories of Mexico and Canada in order to benefit from free trade if they produce within North America. So yes, there will have to be some concessions, but the secret is working with the relevant players within the US political system to constrain Trump. Now, in terms of the second part of the question, which is the relationship with the European Union, well, Mexico has renegotiated and modernized our global agreement with the European Union, and it's been ready in order to be ratified for at least 2 years. The thing is that we haven't done within the European Parliament and then with the parliaments, not only of the 27 European Union countries, but also the subnational parliaments of some of them, the lobbying in order to go further into the ratification of this treaty. So what I see is that now we have the incentive, both from the Mexican side and the European side, to hurry a bit in terms of finally ratifying this modernized global agreement between Mexico and the European Union. And I love the idea of what Patrick says in terms of not only thinking about bilateral agreements between Mexico and the European Union and Canada and the European Union. If we're both part of North America and we both have a free trade agreement with the European Union, why not have a really global agreement between North America and Europe, whether we include or exclude the United States? That will be the central point, which will be decided based on how the USMCA is reviewed or renegotiated next year or probably even this year.
Thank you, Jorge. Yeah, that would indeed be a powerful move. We have another question to both of you. Who could be a forerunner in Europe to improve transatlantic relations with Mexico and Canada, and where do you see challenges?
One phrase: like-minded countries. That is, those which believe in multilateral institutions, which believe in democracy, which believe in rule of law. Unfortunately, what we're seeing within Europe is that several countries are little by little becoming more populist and to the right, many of them, like, for example, the cases of Hungary, the cases of Italy, the cases of Slovenia, the Czech Republic, etc., etc. So obviously, those countries are less and less like-minded. Who are the really like-minded countries? Well, Germany, to a certain extent, France, if the right doesn't become more powerful, Spain, and definitely the Scandinavian countries. So those which still believe in institutions both at the national level and democracy and at the international level through multilateral organizations. This will be the relevant players not only within Europe, but also in other regions of the world. For example, that will be also the case in Asia Pacific, with South Korea, with Japan, with Australia, in terms of building this coalition of the willing or of the like-minded. I call them constructive powers because they can actually make a difference when they work together.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to what Jorge just said. I like his term constructive powers as opposed to destructive powers. I think so. Maybe we should talk about the constructive alliance or something like that. But definitely, I think we the idea of these liberal democracies coming together and ensuring that this world that we believe in, that we cherish, that we work so hard to establish, doesn't fall apart and be destroyed by authoritarian governments, whether in Russia, China, or the United States. So I think, yeah, it's really a call for action, a call for construction, a call for maintaining the things that we value. And I think we do have the possibilities. I think there's been a high degree of complacency in many levels in Europe, in Canada, probably. I'm not so sure, but I would think so also in Mexico, about things will just be good. The US will be there, but now we can't count on the US anymore. So we really have to think about a world where we cannot count on the United States. At best, the US withdraws, plays less of a role, but there's a risk that it becomes much more destructive, especially for its neighbors in Canada and Mexico, but also its withdrawal in terms of the security alliance, NATO. So I think that's really where countries, as mentioned by Jorge, I think those are definitely the ones that we want to work with to push forward, and then hopefully bring others along the way to give them an alternative, as opposed to say, well, you can choose Russia, you can choose China, you can choose the US, but then you're dealing with countries that definitely will take advantage of you, even so. I think there has to be a positive, constructive alternative out there, and I think countries like Mexico can be leaders with the European countries.
Thank you. Another question to both speakers. Do you believe the Trump administration will achieve its economic, trade, and reindustrialization goals within its 4-year term?
A certain degree, yes, because it's generating the incentives for production to go back to the US. And at least what I've seen is that many countries, especially Asian countries, which used to invest in Mexico in order to have free access to North America, are now considering the option of actually building their stuff within the United States. What companies want is to reduce as much the risk, and therefore we will see, as long as it is competitive, that some of these industries will start producing within the US. And that's what I would like to underscore, as long as it is competitive. The thing is that many of these companies are not competitive within the US due to the high costs of labor and also the higher cost of the needed materials to produce something. And that's why North America has been so successful, because we are competitive in terms of each of the 3 countries putting what they're best in and what they're cheaper on in terms of doing regional production and not only national production. So the fast answer is yes, to some extent, but not to the level to which Trump would definitely like to.
I think the Jorge's condition is crucial, right? But I don't believe that. I think the US will be poor in 4 years from now. Doesn't mean that Trump or his supporters or the MAGA people won't be in charge. But I do believe that the US economy will be poor as a result. I think in one way, it justifies the retaliation from, let's say, Canada's perspective. I know Mexico has had a different approach, although so far it's not clear which one is winning. It seems that the impacts have been pretty much the same. But the retaliation obviously makes it more difficult for the US economy, but it also makes it difficult to establish a long-term basis, because if, let's say, the US imposes tariffs, but no one else does, well, then it just justifies even more this idea of reshoring, reindustrializing, but they get the benefits of exports that go with it as a result of that. So, and other economies will become poorer as a result. So I think we need to take the short-term hit, but also that kind of puts even more pressure economically on the US, and hoping that the current moment will be as short as possible, and in a way gain leverage with negotiating with the Americans. But I don't see in the current context, with the US government being atrophied, with the uncertainty that is happening with Trump the way he is, I just don't see how the US economy will come out better, including with the immigration crackdown that is happening. Where are the workers going to be to build all this stuff, to make all this stuff? That's the big question.
Thank you. We are 3 minutes above time, but we have one last question. Although both of you have touched on some aspects of the question, I still want to ask it because it's in the Q&A. It is how serious will the long-term negative consequences of the Trump administration be in terms of the economy, security, and diplomacy? Can they be fixed again as when Biden decided to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement?
Yes, it can be rebuilt, but it will take time. And the thing is that it's difficult to gain trust once you've lost it. And what's happening with the Trump administration is that, unfortunately, it is a non-trustworthy partner, because you can't guarantee that they will be there fulfilling their agreements today, tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow during the Trump administration. So there will be a huge cost. And now, in terms of the economy, clearly it is going into a recession with inflation. And recession with inflation is the best way for voters to decide to change their vote and go against the politicians which are attacking their pockets. One thing which is important from the Canadian and the Mexican side is the best that can happen to Mexico and Canada is for the US to be growing, because if the US is in a good condition, then Canada and Mexico will be in a good condition, because we're very similar in the sense that we're very open economies. If you sum the imports and exports of Canada and the imports and exports of Mexico, they represent approximately 80% of our GDP. That's huge in both cases. And we are both stuck with the US because we send 80% of our exports. So diversification is difficult in the short term. We should try to do it in the longer term, but at least in the next 3 and 10 months that we still have a Trump administration, probably we will suffer a bit, and regaining what has been lost will take longer than the time that it took to destroy it.
I have nothing to add to this. I fully agree with Jorge's comment.
Okay, thank you very much. And this webinar is then coming to an end. Thank you very much, especially to both our experts joining from Canada and from Poland. In the case of Jorge, thanks to everyone for listening, watching, and we hope that we could deliver some insights. And we will continue this conversation between Canada and Mexico, and we have gotten some pretty interesting proposals in terms of transatlantic cooperation between Canada, Mexico, and the European Union, maybe with the United States, maybe without the United States. The coming month and years will let us see where this is headed. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day, wherever you are, and be safe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Thank you very much. See you soon.
Thank you so much. Bye.